Yeah, so a few months ago, I debated Matt Dillahunty on the resurrection of Jesus. A few months later after that, Paulogia responded to the debate with a response video.
When Paul released his video, I was like, I'll get to it. And I heard you guys chattering about the philosophical issues. And I even heard from an atheist saying that, oh no. Like, I mean, there's just a lot of philosophical errors. And so it'll be very helpful to sort of go through this and see where Paul is making an error, respond, show how he's getting Than's arguments wildly wrong. He's contradicting himself.
Paulogia's video and his response, I went away incredibly disappointed, saddened, and also confused.
Welcome to Paulogia.
And Tim, it's Paulogia, not Paulogia. Get it right.
Okay, I don't even know. I hear people say both things. Is that what it is? Paulogia?
Paulogia. He says it all the time.
See, this is the problem. I don't watch this guy.
Where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, we're not actually looking at a live stream response to me, but instead to a blog article response to me written by Than Christopoulos, the mustachioed gentleman who appeared in that live stream.
Paulogia, it's time to stop. Full response. By Than Christopoulos. Updated May 22nd, 2025, 7:55 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Summary. Paulogia, yet again, misunderstands the Max Data Case for the resurrection of Jesus. This is an article unpacking the logic and the issues with the way he and many other skeptics engage with the argument. Editor's note, this is an academic-level version of the more pop-level response I wrote. If you want a more condensed and simpler read, please consider reading that version instead.
I see. So Than's argument is so complicated that there's a remedial version for dummies. It's clear from that live stream which version they think I should read.
You know, I have no idea what ball Paulogia was trying to swing at.
He's spending a lot of time addressing it right now.
Yeah.
And really poorly.
It's like, dude, you're supposed to be like talking about Christianity and responding to Christians, and like this is like your shtick, and you don't even know that, or you forgot that. It's
all I'm trying to say is Paul's math is not math in here. Like, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but this is just again highlighting how badly Paul's handling the arguments.
Dude, are you even trying?
As you can see, I'm probably not even bright enough for the watered down version. But fortunately, someone who is very smart and wrote a response to Than's blog called Bayes' Theorem and a Critique of the Maximal Case for the Resurrection. Regular viewers may remember Dr. Brian Blais from his peer-reviewed paper he co-authored with Camille Gregor called Is Name Popularity a Good Test of Historicity? And the video about it we did on this channel. He has a PhD in physics from Brown University on the topic of computational neuroscience, is a professor in the Department of Biological and Biomedical Sciences at Bryant University, where he teaches on topics of computational modeling and statistical inference. He wrote a book called Statistical Inference for Everyone. So hopefully Brian can make this all so simple that even Paulogia can understand.
That's a lot to ask.
Paulogia recently tweeted this.
Maximal Case for the Resurrection or historical reportage model are just for the Bible tells me so, with extra steps.
This sounds clever until you think about it for more than 5 seconds, because in reality, it reflects a deep misunderstanding of both the methodology and the epistemology behind historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. Beneath the tweet's rhetorical smirk lies a serious confusion, one that collapses careful historical inference into the caricature of blind faith, and dismisses sophisticated evidential models by reducing them to Sunday school slogans. Now, to be clear, this kind of dismissal isn't surprising from Paul. It's one of his go-to rhetorical moves. Why offer detailed engagement with a nuanced model when you can say something that sounds smart, especially if you say it with confidence and derision? It's a pattern I've encountered firsthand. See, for instance, how badly he misunderstood or misrepresented my position in his video here, and how Mike and I responded here.
One of the points I wish to make in this video is that much of the disagreement which sparked Than's blog post is that the two are talking about different things, and I hope to show this using Bayesian analysis so that Than can more clearly understand this. But to claim that Paulogia is just trying to take cheap shots and can't handle nuance is ridiculous. Just go and watch any of his videos like Who Really Wrote the Gospels or How Not to Defend the Resurrection Against Minimal Witnesses to see that Paulogia is one of the most careful and considered YouTubers in the field, and that it is not a coincidence that the likes of Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, and even William Lane Craig have had to address his content. So enough with the ad hominems, let's get to the content. So I have a few goals with this video. One is to show that Than's original disagreement with Paulogia comes from the two of them talking past each other, and I hope to show where this arises in the Bayesian analysis. Two, to correct or improve some of Than's notation and approach to make the points clearer. Number three, show where Than's argument goes awry using Bayesian analysis and hopefully direct the conversation in a more productive direction.
So yes, I'm writing a blog post responding to a tweet, and there's a reason for that. I regularly get emails and messages from thoughtful people, Christians and skeptics alike, asking how to respond to one-liners like this. People feel the rhetorical weight of these kinds of objections, even when the intellectual content is hollow. That's because tweets like Paul's operate as intuition pumps. They bypass argument and appeal directly to audience bias. Add in a bit of well-poisoning, call your interlocutor an apologist, derogatory, so your audience assumes they're just inventing excuses. And you've got yourself a demagogue's toolbox.
The people I call apologists are people who self-identify as doing apologetics. Any derogatory connotation is a perception of the label, not me assigning a label. Though I prefer non-theist, I do self-identify as an atheist, which is a very derogatory term to swaths of your Christian audience. But I wouldn't accuse you of well-poisoning to introduce me as such. Now, my friend Mr. Deity, he does have a derogatory version.
All of us together have to stop using the term apologist and start calling these people what they are, excusagists.
The rest of this post unpacks what I think is actually going on behind Paul's comment. Philosophically, epistemically, and historically, especially in light of my past interactions with him, because once we slow down and examine the assumptions, it becomes clear that the tweet isn't just wrong. It reveals the very dogmatism and double standard it pretends to critique. We'll explore 1. What the historical reportage model, HRM, actually is. 2. What the maximal data case involves as a historical inference, not a theological presupposition. 3. Why Paulogia's objection relies on outdated and poor Humean reasoning. 4. And how some deeper mistakes skeptics make when it comes to this topic. So buckle up. While this is only going to briefly cover a lot of the important points, it is still going to be rather dense, because once we clear away the rhetoric, what remains is just a mix of bad reasoning. Fire 1. The historical reportage model, HRM, and the max data case. Honestly, I'm a little confused that Paul is still making this mistake. In the videos I linked above, we explicitly pointed out where he collapsed categories. Apparently, saying this clearly in my debate with Matt Dillahunty wasn't enough. Neither was the correction Mike and I offered in a live stream. So let's clarify what he's trying to dismiss. His one-liner only works if he collapses two distinct things into one.
Yes, that's what the extra steps part of the tweet means.
That just sounds like slavery with extra steps.
Ooh la la. I'm not pretending to collapse the extra steps. I'm saying they are superfluous steps that can be collapsed.
But the historical reportage model, HRM, and the maximal data case are two separate stages of reasoning. They are not interchangeable, and neither functions like the other.
I didn't intend to say they're interchangeable with the unfortunately ambiguous conjunction or. I was simply putting them in the same category of things that reduce to. As we'll see, if I'd have used the and conjunction in my casual tweet, then many of Than's complaints would disappear, since he views them as successive steps of a process.
Just like we have models of the universe, we can also have models of many other things. In this case, the HRM is a hypothesis about the genre and intent of the gospel documents. It asks, what kind of literature are we dealing with? Did the authors intend to report real events in the life of Jesus as accurately as possible, based on eyewitness testimony? That's it. The HRM is not a claim that the Gospels are inspired. It is not a claim that the Gospels are inerrant. It is not even a claim that the events described actually happened.
And for the Bible tells me so is not, and has never been, an accusation that you think the Gospels are inspired or that they are inerrant. I use it exclusively when people derive information from a single source, one of the 66 documents in the Protestant Bible, or a combination of the documents that are not independent of each other.
You're not trying to represent our position fairly. You're not steel manning it so you can knock it down. You're straw manning it so you can get some nice laughs and giggles from your audience and feel like you did something here.
What the HRM affirms is this, that the gospel authors understood themselves to be operating within the broad genre of historical biography, that they sought to record the deeds and teachings of Jesus in good faith based on sources they considered reliable, including eyewitnesses and early oral tradition, and that they did not see themselves as having literary license to invent or reshape historical events for purely theological, symbolic, or moral purposes. To be clear, this is not question begging, it's a modeling assumption used here to explore what the evidence implies if the documents are treated as testimony. For full argumentation on why the HRM is justified, see our series doing just that. If HRM holds, then the Gospels, whatever else one believes about them, function as access points to the earliest public testimony about Jesus. That includes what the original witnesses claimed happened. Again, this does not translate to the Gospels say X, therefore X.
What I'm hearing is the Gospels say X, the Gospels are historical reportage is reliable, therefore the Gospels are reliable, therefore X, which is the Gospels say X, therefore X, with extra steps. But carry on with the nuance I'm missing by jumping ahead.
In other words, HRM doesn't smuggle in the conclusion. It is only speaking on what kind of documents we are dealing with. Why does this matter? Because the model you choose frames the data you analyze. If HRM is true, then the prior probability of a given pericope being invented is low. If a skeptical model is true, one where the authors felt free to fabricate or embellish, the prior probability of a given pericope being made up is high. Again, this does not mean the events reported necessarily happened. If Luke reports that person A said X happened and HRM holds, person A's report of X could still be fabricated, mistaken, or embellished. The HRM simply gets us to the testimony. So we separate the historical investigation into two stages. 1. What kind of document were the gospel authors trying to write? HRM. 2. Given that, what actually happened? Max Data Case.
Fair enough. HRM on its own gets us the Gospels say X, the Gospels are historical reportage. Historical reportage means the author believed it to be true. Therefore, the Gospel authors believed what they wrote to be true. Therefore, the Gospel authors believed X to be true. While I don't agree, I could actually grant this conclusion for the sake of argument. None of my doubts about the resurrection are contingent on the insincerity of the Gospel authors.
The HRM answers only the first. The second depends on further evaluation. From this point forward, all of our evidential assessments assume the HRM is true. That is not question begging. It's simply conditional reasoning. Given that the Gospels were written with serious historical intent and based on eyewitness claims, what is the probability of this evidence under competing hypotheses?
Unless I'm mistaken, we've come all this way to agree that the Gospels are a type of testimony.
The Maximal Data Case builds upon the HRM, but remains firmly within the domain of public historical reasoning. It asks, if the gospel authors were reporting eyewitness-based claims in good faith, without the freedom to invent historical details, then what best explains the content, pattern, and effects of that testimony, given the cultural, political, and religious context in which it emerged?
So where Than wants us to go is, the gospel authors believed X to be true. The most likely reason that the gospel authors believed X to be true is because it was true. Therefore, X is most likely true. I'm still feeling pretty good about my extra steps evaluation, but let's get into the math so that Brian can help. Since
Paul's math is not math in here. This is where explanatory models come in, as well as a proper methodology. The Maximal Data Case looks at historically accessible facts, such as, but not limited to, the crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate, the early proclamation of the resurrection in Jerusalem, the empty tomb, as independently attested across traditions, the polymodal, post-mortem appearances to individuals and groups, the conversions of skeptics like James and Paul, and the rise of a resurrection-centric movement that exploded across hostile cultural environments. And it asks, what is the probability of all this data, given the differing hypotheses and our background knowledge? In other words, given these data points, the question becomes, which hypothesis best accounts for them? And this is where a formal structure is not just helpful, but necessary. In formal terms, we are evaluating a likelihood ratio. Don't worry, I will translate the math in section 3. Probability of the evidence, given the resurrection and background knowledge. Probability of the evidence, given any alternative theory and background knowledge, where equals the body of historical evidence. HRs equals the resurrection hypothesis, halt equals any competing hypothesis, e.g. hallucination theory, theft, legend. K equals relevant background knowledge, including the HRM, i.e. so that the Gospels are good faith historical reportage. Here is a simple translation of the math. The numerator, the top half, is the probability of the evidence given the resurrection and our background knowledge, and the denominator, the bottom, is the probability of the evidence given, any alternative hypothesis to the resurrection, and our background knowledge. Put simply, we are just asking about the ratio of how expected the data is given any competing hypotheses. It sounds fancy, but this is just how sound reasoning works in any intellectual discipline. If some data is more expected on one hypothesis over another, then that is going to raise the probability of hypothesis. This matters for 3 reasons. 1. HRM is part of the background knowledge K, not the evidence. Once granted, we treat the gospel documents as sincere reportage, not myth, late legend, or symbolic fiction. 2. The likelihood ratio is separate from prior probability. Even if one assigns a low prior to the resurrection, the evidence may still be far more expected under that hypothesis than under any alternative. 3. It gives our methodology structure. This isn't what feels true. It's inference to the best explanation based on publicly accessible data. Importantly, we don't presume the resurrection. It must earn its place in the model by explaining the evidence better than all alternatives. Of course, skeptics often appeal to low priors to dismiss the resurrection from the outset. But that's a different discussion. One we'll address in Section 3, Humean assumptions, and Section 4, Bayesian priors and background knowledge. For now, the point is this. The maximal data case isn't just believe with footnotes. It's a rigorous explanatory framework. Why skeptics collapse. The two Paulogia's rhetorical move only works if he collapses two distinct stages of reasoning into one, and then flattens them into because the Bible says so. But why does this conflation happen so often? There seems to be a few options on the table, one being that it's just an honest mistake. If I am being less charitable, it seems to be because if the historical reportage model, HRM, is granted, the resurrection becomes too evidentially powerful to dismiss without shifting the standards. And that's a problem for the skeptic. Let's be more precise. If the Gospels are treated as sincere historical reportage based on eyewitness testimony, HRM, then we have access to the original public claims surrounding the resurrection of Jesus that pushes the debate into the realm of inference, not theological dogma. And from there, the maximal data case begins doing real explanatory work. It says, given this data, what hypothesis makes the most sense? And here's the underlying tension. If you're already committed to the human idea that miracle claims are so improbable that no amount of testimony could ever justify belief, then the maximal data case becomes threatening. Because on explanatory grounds alone, the resurrection might actually come out ahead. That puts the skeptic in an epistemically awkward position. If the data really are more probable on the resurrection hypothesis than on the alternatives, then something has to give. Either the prior assumptions or the integrity of the method. To avoid facing that dilemma, many skeptics opt to short-circuit the conversation entirely. The move is simple. Collapse the HRM and the maximal case into one flattened caricature. You believe in the resurrection because the Bible says so.
Before getting into the math, there are a few non-math comments I feel I need to make. I really dislike the claim that someone is just performing a rhetorical move to, quote, avoid facing an uncomfortable conclusion. This seems to invoke mind reading that I am not confident exists. I have heard it said that it is far easier to ascribe good reasoning to your side of an argument and psychological motives to your opponent. This is what seems to be happening here. So why would Paulogia state that both HRM and max data are equivalent to, quote, for the Bible tells me so? Why would he do this even while Than insists that HRM, or the historical reportage model, does not imply biblical inerrancy? The problem stems from the following. If you accept the historical reportage model, HRM, namely that, quote, the gospel authors sought to record the deeds and teachings of Jesus in good faith based on sources they considered reliable, including eyewitnesses and early oral tradition, and they did not see themselves as having literary license to invent or reshape historical events for purely theological, symbolic, or moral purposes, close quote. Then you must accept things like the authors were eyewitnesses and honestly claimed to have eaten fish and touched the wounds of Jesus after he was crucified and buried for 3 days. No skeptic accepts this. And the only reason to accept the fish and wound story is, in fact, quote, for the Bible tells me so. The Gospels, and sometimes only one Gospel, is the only source for these stories. The max data case assumes HRM at every point, and so it too inherits the, quote, for the Bible tells me so. All of the math that Than provides doesn't change this fact, but I think we can make it more clear by doing the analysis again, correcting some things along the way, and see where Than's analysis fits into the correction, and see where that lands us.
It's rhetorically efficient, but intellectually evasive. Not only is this both logically and mathematically mistaken, as we will see later, but it's also a move of epistemic self-protection. By conflating the two stages, literary intent and explanatory inference, the skeptic avoids having to engage either. It's much easier to mock than to methodically evaluate.
Again, more mind reading here. We can do better.
So let's be clear. The HRM is a claim about literary genre, authorial intention, and proximity to sources. The maximal data case is a probabilistic inference from public data to the best explanation. Neither one assumes inspiration or inerrancy. Neither assumes the resurrection actually happened. Neither requires prior belief in a miracle. But once these distinctions are made explicit, the rhetorical power of Paulogia's tweet dissolves. Because now the real question is this: if the gospel authors were engaged in good faith historical reportage, and the evidence is what it is, then what best explains what they claimed? That's where the real argument begins. And it's precisely the argument skeptics like Paulogia prefer not to have. Let's move on. Hume Paulogia's dismissal of the maximal data case as just believe with extra steps comes dressed with another assumption that before even examining the data, miracle claims are disqualified on epistemic grounds. It's Humean dogma, and it's one of the most persistent and, in my opinion, intellectually bankrupt moves in the modern skeptic's playbook. What do Humeans think? In an inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume famously argued that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be.
While I don't entirely agree with Hume's wording of the uniformity of nature argument, if we start with Hume's argument against testimony, namely, quote, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish, close quote. You'd be hard-pressed to interpret this as not being a simple application of Bayes' theorem. This is the only part of Hume that Paulogia or any skeptic requires. This is not Humean dogma, it is a straightforward application of reason and has a direct mapping to Bayes' theorem, as I've written in my blog. I would like to know what Than thinks is an alternative.
Now, to be fair, there are multiple ways to interpret what Hume means here. Some take him to be making a strong metaphysical claim that miracles are impossible, but I don't think Paulogia would want to endorse that stronger reading.
That's correct. I don't endorse the stronger reading, but for some reason, Than will return to it as if I do. So we'll just point those out and skip them.
So let's engage with the more modest interpretation, which is more common today among philosophical skeptics. Under the more charitable reading, Hume isn't arguing miracles are impossible. Rather, he's claiming they are so intrinsically improbable, so contrary to uniform human experience, that no amount of testimonial evidence could ever reasonably establish one. Why? Because testimony is always weaker than the firm and unalterable course of nature. That's the move Paulogia is making here. The maximal data case could be airtight. Every line of testimony could align with every independent source, and it wouldn't matter, because on this view, miracles are ruled out before the evidence is even considered.
Well, no. Evidence and testimony are not synonymous. If the miracle claims were aligned with independent, non-testimony sources, then the miracle discussion would be back on the table.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Why this isn't neutral skepticism? I will offer a more in-depth critique of the Humean view later on, but for now, I just want to say the following. Let's be absolutely clear. This isn't historical caution. It's not a call for critical thinking. It's a built-in firewall that shields naturalism from evidential challenge by making miracle claims inadmissible by definition. The result is a rigged game. If you argue for a miracle based on testimony, the skeptic says testimony can never overcome the prior improbability. If you strengthen the testimony, the skeptic insists it's still probably fabricated or mistaken, because miracles don't happen. It's an epistemic catch-22.
This is not a catch-22. It's an admission that the testimonial evidence is just not good enough. When Than says, quote, strengthen the testimony, close quote, all he's presented is more testimony. So the first point still holds. No amount of testimony should ever convince us of a miracle, or any other modification of our understanding of physics or biology. Unfortunately, all the apologists have is testimony, and more testimony, because all they have are texts. Could you imagine any amount of testimony convincing us that, say, the speed of light is not constant, or a perpetual motion machine exists? There's a good reason we have the methods of science, and we don't credulously believe claims on someone's, really anyone's, say-so.
Why Hume and Paulogia are wrong with all this in mind. Paulogia's objection isn't just rhetorically dismissive, it's also philosophically fragile. Like many modern skeptics, he borrows from a Humean framework that misunderstands probability, abuses priors, and collapses under scrutiny. In this section, we'll show how a proper Bayesian framework undermines the entire Humean objection, and why the resurrection remains on the table as a live historical hypothesis. What is Bayesian reasoning? In order to keep going, we need to talk about probability theory a little bit. If you want to argue that miracles are implausible, you need to speak the language of probability. That's what David Hume tried to do, and what modern skeptics like Paulogia continue to echo. But the moment you step into that domain, you're stepping into the world of Bayesian reasoning. And when used correctly, Bayesian reasoning doesn't block miracles. It simply asks us to evaluate them in proportion to the evidence.
In this, Than and I are in agreement. Our beliefs should be proportional to the evidence.
So let's walk through what this actually looks like. The basic structure. Bayes' theorem gives us a formal way of updating our beliefs when we encounter new evidence. It doesn't tell us what to believe outright. It tells us how to responsibly adjust our confidence in a hypothesis in light of new data. The formal version looks like this. I will be using the odds form of the equation because this is going to be about competing theories, where ... p of h given E equals posterior odds that the hypothesis is true, given the evidence P of not h given E equals posterior odds that the alternative hypothesis is true, given the evidence P of h divided by P of not h equals prior odds. Your initial confidence in h before seeing the evidence. P of E given h equals likelihood. How expected the evidence is if h is true. P of E given not h equals likelihood. How expected the evidence is if h is false.
This is correct, but I prefer the notation I introduced in my book Statistical Inference for Everyone, rather than the odds form here. In my notation, we write the probability of each hypothesis on its own line, write the numerator of Bayes' theorem, and then calculate the denominator separately. Rewriting the previous equation that Than presented would look like the following. The probability of the hypothesis given the evidence is related to the probability of the evidence, if we assume the hypothesis is true, times the prior probability of the hypothesis. That's the first line. The second line would be the opposite. The probability of the hypothesis being false, given the evidence, would be related to the probability of the evidence if we assume that the hypothesis is false, times the prior probability that the hypothesis is false. At least to my eye, there is less mathematical clutter, and one can see the contribution of the prior and the likelihood terms easily. However, one additional benefit of this approach is that we can easily extend it to as many models or hypotheses as we'd like. I find that the apologists who are interested in Bayes' theorem universally use the odds form, which restricts one to think in binary terms, hiding a lot in the process. One place to see the multiple model comparison is in my analysis of the psychic octopus and my high-low nines deck problem, which we'll look at later. You can see the binary thinking result in a lack of imagination in the long discussion on miracles I had with others on the Digital Gnosis channel.
What does all this mean? Why use ratios in the first place? Because we're comparing two competing hypotheses, one that says the event or claim is true, H, and one that says it's false, not H. The goal isn't to ask, is this absolutely certain? But rather, which of these two explanations is better supported by the evidence? That's exactly what the odds form of Bayes' theorem is built for. It gives us a way to measure how the evidence shifts the balance between two competing ideas.
We may want to compare more than two competing hypotheses, in which case the odds form fails us.
The tiger example. Imagine someone tells you they saw a tiger loose in your suburban neighborhood. You hear someone say, "There's a tiger loose in the neighborhood." Your initial reaction? No way. Tigers don't roam the suburbs. So your prior odds, which are a way of expressing how unlikely something is before seeing new evidence, are very low. For example, odds of 1 to 9,999 means a 0.01% chance. But now let's break it down using Bayes' theorem step by step. Step 1. Define the hypotheses. H. There is a tiger loose in the neighborhood. Not H. There is not a tiger loose. Something else is going on. A prank, misidentification, etc. Step 2. Assign prior odds. How likely did you think this was before hearing any evidence? Let's say P of H equals 1 in 10,000. The prior probability of a loose tiger, P of not H, equals 9,999 in 10,000. The prior probability that there isn't, we compute the prior odds. Step 3, evaluate the evidence. Now suppose you text 3 friends and ask them if they heard about the tiger. All of them happen to be in a group and claim to have seen the tiger themselves. In your background knowledge, you know they are truthful people that would not play a prank on you, and you know they each have jobs in the area where the alleged tiger is loose. That's the body of evidence. We now ask P of E given H. How likely is it that we'd see this evidence if there really were a tiger loose? Let's say it's quite high, maybe 0.95, 95%. E given not H. How likely is it that we'd see this same evidence if there were no tiger? Much lower, maybe 0.001. We compute the likelihood ratio. 0.95 over 0.001, getting 950. Step 4, multiply by the prior odds. Bayes' odds form. Now we just fill in the numbers and get 0.095. Step 5, convert to posterior probability. We've been using odds so far since Bayes' theorem is clearest in that form, but now we'll convert them into probabilities so the result is easier to grasp intuitively. Remember, our conversion formula is so, or more simply. Step 6, interpret the result. You started with near total skepticism, just a 0.01% chance that the Tiger report was true at one compelling piece of evidence. Testimony from 3 trusted friends who were in the right place at the right time and who independently reported seeing the tiger. You ran the numbers and landed at a new confidence of 8.7%. That might still sound low, but don't miss what just happened. You didn't go from impossible to absolute certainty. You went from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 11.5. That's a nearly 900-fold increase in confidence from just 3 text messages. You're not just entertaining the idea anymore. You're probably looking at the news, doing some Google searches, texting other people, maybe even locking your door. That's what rational belief revision looks like.
Both doors have tigers.
Just for completeness, it may be helpful to see the same math using my notation. Than has the following numbers for his problem. The prior probability for the hypothesis is 1 out of 10,000, so that means the prior probability of the hypothesis being false is 9,999 out of 10,000. The probability of the evidence given the hypothesis is 0.95, and the probability that the evidence given that the hypothesis is false is 0.001. These are Than's numbers. The calculation proceeds by writing down the numerators first, sum them to obtain the denominator, also known as the total probability, and then divide by that total. So we can see writing down each of those terms, plugging them in, summing to get t, and then going back and redividing. The result is the same, as is the interpretation, so we have no argument with Than with this example. I always like to repeat someone's calculation myself to make sure that I'm doing the math correctly. It would have been nice to have an example with more than one hypothesis to see how the calculation can go, but you can find examples of this in my writings.
But what if more evidence came in? Now imagine this. You open your local news app, it confirms the tiger report, like there is video footage of the tiger, police issue a public safety alert, another group chat says animal control has been dispatched. None of this is speculative. It's concrete, independent, and mutually reinforcing.
And some of that isn't strictly testimony, is it? Video footage isn't testimony. In my community, public safety alerts come up on everyone's phone and also a website. So I have non-testimony evidence that the alert has been made. A group chat about animal control would be testimony, but if someone has images or video of animal control, or if animal control has their own alert system, that becomes non-testimony evidence. This is a common move for apologist hypotheticals, smuggling in non-analogous, non-testimony evidence.
You update again. This time your confidence doesn't just move to 15% or 30%, it skyrockets to approximately 99%. You've gone from no way to I'm convinced. Why spend so much time explaining this? You might be thinking, okay, cool math, but why does this actually matter? Because this isn't just about tigers or resurrections. It's about how we reason, especially when the claim is surprising, uncomfortable, or unprecedented. Bayes' theorem doesn't force you to believe in miracles. It doesn't demand that you accept anything supernatural. It simply formalizes one key question. Which explanation makes the evidence more expected? And that's the crux.
Actually, Bayes' theorem does more than making us choose, quote, which explanation makes the evidence more expected, close quote. It frames a problem of determining which hypothesis is most likely given the data as a balance between how expected each explanation makes the evidence and the prior probability of that hypothesis. Both parts are needed, as well as an exhaustive list of the relevant hypotheses. I find that apologists interested in Bayes focus almost entirely on the likelihood part, the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis part, and hardly any time at all on the prior or being specific about the alternatives. It is not surprising that a magical explanation will explain, quote, evidence of magical sounding reports, which is why apologists focus on this part. It's the only part of the analysis which might actually favor the magical explanation. The prior and the alternatives do not favor those types of explanations.
Even if your prior confidence in a claim is extremely low, strong enough evidence can shift the scale. If that evidence is far more likely under one hypothesis than its competitors. That's exactly what happened in the tiger example. You began with a skeptical prior, but when multiple pieces of independent evidence converged, school closures, news alerts,
This is not testimony.
trusted witnesses, animal control, you didn't say, tigers don't live in the suburbs, so this can't be real. You let the evidence move you.
So let's make this analogy more clear and where it differs from the resurrection case. The prior for tigers is much higher than that of a resurrection. Even Than has 1 out of 10,000 for the prior of a tiger and only 1 in a million for the resurrection. I find it remarkable that Than would consider these even reasonable numbers before assessing any data, that a person rising from the dead, against all of our best understanding of how the universe works, is only 100 times less likely than seeing a tiger. Even Than's prior of 1 in a million for the resurrection is ludicrously too large, despite his insistence that this is a very skeptical prior. A very simple estimate, taking the entire known population ever to lived on the planet, around 100 billion, with at most one resurrection, puts it at below 1 in 100 billion. And that is before we include our understanding of biology, of the psychology of extraordinary claims, of physics, etc., etc. The prior will be much, much lower than 1 in 100 billion, so I will treat that as an upper estimate. Also, you have to establish that the evidence is in fact independent for this calculation to be done in this way. In the case of the tiger reports, this might be a challenge to establish. But for the Gospels, this is almost certainly untrue. There is clear evidence of non-independence in the reports.
That's the difference between reasoning and rationalizing. One adjusts belief based on what is expected, the other blocks belief based on what is allowed. Bayes doesn't care how strange the claim is. It only cares how well the claim explains what we actually see. Let that sink in. This is exactly what we'll do with the resurrection. We'll now walk through the resurrection case, just like we did here, one piece of evidence at a time. We'll start with extreme skepticism. We'll examine each data point, group appearances, hostile conversions, the empty tomb, the transformation of a movement, and we'll let the evidence speak. Not once will we assume the conclusion. We'll simply ask at every step, given this, what's more expected, naturalism or resurrection? You'll see how, even with the lowest possible prior, the explanatory power of the resurrection makes it very hard to ignore. Let's begin. Applying this to the resurrection, so far, we've seen how Bayesian reasoning helps us assess surprising claims, not by gut instinct or metaphysical veto, but by comparing how well different explanations account for the evidence. Now let's plug the resurrection of Jesus into that framework. I want to be upfront about something though. In this section, I am granting a low prior probability for the resurrection for sake of simplicity. We will challenge that soon. We start with our structure, odds form with labels for resurrection and alternative theories, where E equals the body of historical evidence, HRs equals the resurrection hypothesis, halt equals any competing hypothesis, e.g., hallucination theory, theft, legend, K equals relevant background knowledge, including the HRM, i.e., that the Gospels are good faith historical reportage.
As a point of notation, I observed that one would never use the plus operator to denote extra information. In logic, the plus operator is attributed to the or operation, not the and operation that Than wants. One can use a dot, a comma, a semicolon instead. Also, this, quote, background information, denoted by K, should be in all of the terms, not just in the likelihood term. This mistake makes Than thinks his conclusions are more general than they actually are. A proper rewriting of this using Than's notation is the following, where K includes the historical reportage model HRM. To make this even more explicit and to reduce the number of symbols and to further avoid some issues with the odds form, I prefer to write the same equation as the following. Each line, the probability of the resurrection given the data and the HRM, and the probability of the alternatives given the data and the HRM. Writing it in this way makes it easy to see the role of the data, the prior, and the alternative models.
Now the question becomes, how much more expected is this body of evidence if Jesus really rose from the dead versus if he didn't? This is our likelihood ratio, and it's the heart of the analysis.
Actually, the likelihood ratio isn't the heart of the analysis. The likelihood part is just one part, with the prior having an equal role, and both are modulated substantially by the alternative models considered.
Let's consider just a few of the facts that I and many other max data and HRM proponents argue for. As a reminder, the purpose here is not to give you the full-fledged case here. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His tomb was later found empty. His followers experienced what they interpreted as post-mortem appearances of Jesus, individually, in groups, and in varying contexts. These experiences transformed frightened followers into bold proclaimers of resurrection, even in the face of persecution and death. These experiences were multisensory in nature. This proclamation emerged in Jerusalem, the very place Jesus was buried, spread rapidly across the Roman world, and became the central claim of the earliest Christian confession. This proclamation happened both in an anticipated hostile environment and continued to happen with voluntary suffering for no earthly reward, and much more. Now ask, would we expect all of that if Jesus stayed dead?
Than has a problem with what the data actually is. He presents things like the, quote, historically accessible facts, close quote, above, but that is not the data. The data is, quote, we have texts that have stories about those historical accessible facts. For example, we have texts that have stories where Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We have texts that have stories where his tomb was later found empty. We have texts that have stories where his followers experienced what they interpreted as post-mortem appearances, etc., etc. Further, there are data points that Than doesn't include that we should, which are not well predicted by the resurrection hypothesis, things that you'd expect to see but don't. This includes no mention of Joseph of Arimathea after the empty tomb story, no mention of many of the specific apostles after the tomb story, the inconsistent messaging of Jesus, for example, meeting in Galilee or Jerusalem, no search by the Romans for a stolen body, which would be the way the Romans would have interpreted any empty tomb, no support for the ascension other than, quote, for the Bible tells me so, which is a requirement for the rest of the story to even make sense.
Would hallucinations alone explain group appearances, polymodal encounters, the empty tomb, and the explosive, resurrection-centered birth of the early church? Would the hallucination theory predict this kind of geographical and chronological proximity between event and proclamation? Would a conspiracy account explain the disciples' willingness to suffer if they knew it was a lie? The resurrection hypothesis isn't just one more possibility. It renders the totality of this evidence far more expected than any alternative.
It is annoying that Christian apologists always pull out the least charitable alternative explanations of the biblical data, and Than is no exception. I would love to see an exception. He comments on hallucination, theft, and legend only. Well, at least he doesn't bother critiquing the swoon theory, which no modern skeptic has ever suggested. What he doesn't do is look at specific alternatives and their explanatory value on the biblical data, such as James Fodor's RHBS model, Paulogia's minimal witnesses model, and Camille Gregor's pareidolia model. I find this problematic because it is easy to argue against hallucinations if you assume that the biblical texts are mostly reliable and they say that 500 people saw Jesus after 3 days. But this ends up being a straw man. So our problem now becomes a multiple model comparison problem. Probability of the resurrection hypothesis given the data, the probability of the RHBS model given the data, the probability of the minimal witnesses model given the data, the probability of the pareidolia model given the data, for all the models that we want to explore. Having just said that, for right now, for convenience, I will follow Than's approach and just lump all the alternatives into one, which I'll just call A. And keep in mind that to do this properly at the end, we really do need to break this single A out into specific cases. Those other models explain the actual data we have and are also consistent with the data we don't observe but would be expected if the resurrection actually happened. So their likelihood terms, the probability of the evidence given each of those models, are as high as the resurrection model, but their priors are much, much higher.
And here's the crucial point. Even if you assign a skeptical prior to the resurrection, a high likelihood ratio still increases its posterior probability. Just like the tiger in the neighborhood, your initial skepticism is real. But as the evidence rolls in, video, school closures, news alerts, you update. Bayes doesn't ask if you like the idea. It asks if the evidence fits. And in the case of Jesus' resurrection, the fit is striking. That doesn't mean the resurrection is proven with 100% certainty. Historical claims rarely are. But it does mean this. If you're reasoning honestly, you can't dismiss the resurrection by fiat. You have to engage the data. And if the resurrection hypothesis makes that data more probable than any alternative, it earns its place at the table, not as dogma, but as the best explanation available.
It hasn't earned its place at the table until the posterior for the resurrection model is actually comparable or greater than the alternatives. If you have a prior of, say, 1 in 100 billion, an upper estimate that I estimated before, and your posterior updates in a positive direction by a factor of 1,000, the posterior would still be 1 in 100 million and not, quote, earn its place at the table. By focusing on just the factor of 1,000 increase, one might erroneously conclude that the posterior was now large. It is no wonder that apologists avoid tackling the prior and avoid tackling real alternatives for which the evidence is expected, and focus instead almost exclusively on the likelihood term.
Running the numbers. Just like our tiger example above, let's run through the topic of the resurrection with the formula. We've laid out the logic of Bayesian reasoning, shown how priors and likelihoods interact, and demonstrated how even unlikely hypotheses can become probable if the evidence is strong enough. Now let's apply that same structure to the resurrection of Jesus. But as a reminder of two things. First, we're going to grant the skeptic a low prior up front. We'll assume the lowest plausible prior imaginable, 1 in a million. Why? Because if the resurrection can survive that, it can survive anything. Second, the HRM is part of our background knowledge in this Bayesian framework. Not the conclusion we're trying to reach. It's what allows us to assign likelihoods to what the documents say. We're asking, given that the Gospels and Acts report claims sincerely made by early individuals, how likely is it that those individuals encountered a risen Jesus versus being deceived, hallucinating, or lying? Let's walk through it step by step, just like we did with the tiger. Define the hypotheses. HRs equals the resurrection hypothesis. Halt equals any competing hypothesis, e.g. hallucination theory, theft, legend. Set the initial prior. We'll grant P of HRs equals 0.000001. P of halt equals 0.999999. Now calculate the prior odds. To clarify, we're not starting with the assumption that the resurrection is likely. We're assuming it's extremely improbable and seeing if the evidence can still move the needle.
Extremely improbable is a matter of degree. Just to get a sense of this, Than is implying that a resurrection is only about twice as unlikely as drawing a royal flush from a deck of cards. Seems a bit high to me.
Sequential evidential updates. Now we'll begin walking through the historical evidence, step by step, updating our probabilities as we go. Each piece of data has already been defended in detail elsewhere, by myself and others, so we won't re-argue every point here. Instead, the goal is to demonstrate how cumulative evidence functions within the Bayesian framework. This is where the strength of the historical reportage model and the maximal data approach becomes clear. Even starting from radical skepticism, the evidence doesn't just nudge belief in the resurrection, it dramatically shifts the odds in its favor.
1 in a million is not radical skepticism for a resurrection claim. Being struck by lightning or a meteorite is on the order of 1 in a million. Being struck by lightning thrown by Zeus or a rock thrown by Hercules would be much, much lower.
This is where the Bayesian scales start to tip. Following Jesus' death, multiple groups and individuals, totaling at least 21 distinct reports found across the Gospels and Acts, are described as having seen, heard, and physically interacted with the risen Jesus. These are not vague references to dreams or isolated inner impressions. They involve multimodal, multisensory encounters over a 40-day window, often in collective settings with multiple participants.
This is where, for the Bible tells me so, comes in again. No skeptic accepts that the actual data is that multiple people across a month had multimodal, multisensory experiences. Not even most biblical scholars accept this. Even Gary Habermas does not include this in his list of minimal facts, referring only to experiences, which could be many things other than direct contact with Jesus.
Now, crucially, this is not an argument that the Bible says it, therefore it happened. That would be circular. Rather, we are granting the historical reportage model, HRM, the view that the Gospel and Acts authors intended to report sincere, eyewitness-rooted historical testimony. We're taking these appearance claims as what people actually said happened and asking how expected those reports are under each hypothesis.
Granting the HRM is equivalent to granting for the Bible tells me so. If we think the HRM combined with the max data as one model, say the resurrection model, it may explain the data, that we have texts that have stories about the various events around Jesus. But so do many other models that do not take the biblical text at face value.
So, given that these accounts most likely reflect sincere testimony from individuals who believe they encountered the risen Jesus, how likely is this body of testimony under H alternative compared to H resurrection? Let's run the numbers and see how this evidence affects our confidence. Step 1. Assign prior odds. We continue from our updated posterior odds from E, but remember, our priors have not changed because E1 was non-probative. So, now calculate the prior odds. Step 2. Evaluate the evidence and compute the likelihood ratio. We now assess how expected this testimony is under each hypothesis. We'll say 0.9. This is very expected if Jesus rose bodily and appeared to his followers. Very briefly, this is what we would expect to see given the resurrection. How likely is it that the same evidence would arise under an alternative hypothesis, e.g. hallucinations, lies, metaphors? Much lower. Let's say 0.0001, given that multimodal group hallucinations are not known to occur, and coordinated falsehoods or symbolic reinterpretations this early face severe explanatory problems. So we calculate the likelihood ratio. Step 3, multiply by the prior odds. Start with Bayes' odds form. Insert the numbers. Step 4, convert to posterior probability. Step 5, interpret the result. We've just made a substantial update. You began at a 0.0001% prior, and now, after just this one line of evidence, you're already at approximately 0.893%. That might still sound low, but don't miss the significance. You didn't go from impossible to certain. You went from 1 in 1 million odds to about 1 in 111 odds. That's a 9,000-fold increase in favor of the resurrection from just a single evidential update. This is what exponential growth looks like in Bayesian reasoning.
Than shows how one can update the calculation sequentially again, including the data on the conversion of skeptic Paul and the presumed skeptic James with made-up numbers to get his final number in this example of the probability of the resurrection given the data equals 88%. But we don't need to walk through it in detail since it uses the same steps as the previous part.
You began this step with just under 1% confidence. Now you're at nearly 88%. That's a radical update. And it happened because this evidence is far more expected if Jesus rose from the dead than if he didn't. The cumulative structure is doing its job. One piece of strong, unexpected evidence transforms the rational outlook.
Here's where we will insert the solution that I am proposing, which I think captures the difference between Paulogia and Than. It is my contention that Paulogia, and myself, care about the posterior probability for the resurrection, namely the probability of the resurrection given the data, and we don't care much about the probability of the resurrection assuming Than's HRM is true, the probability of the resurrection given the data and HRM. Than cares more about the latter than the former, or at least only addresses the latter, not the former. As such, Than interprets Paulogia's dismissal of HRM and the max data as, quote, for the Bible tells me so, as a rhetorical move, when in fact they are each talking about different mathematical terms. In order to handle this mathematically, we need to relate these two terms, which we can do with a process called marginalization. You can see this on page 105 of Laurito's excellent From Laplace to Supernova paper. All marginalization is a process of breaking up a single probability term, say probability of hypothesis, into a sum of terms conditional on a variable and multiplied by the prior of that variable. The probability of the hypothesis will be equal to the sum of two terms. First one is the probability of the hypothesis given the variable times the prior of that variable, plus the probability of that hypothesis given the opposite of that variable times the prior of the opposite of that variable, breaking it up into these two terms. Applying this to the variable of the HRM, we get the following somewhat messy equations for the probability of the resurrection given the data and the probability of the alternatives given the data, broken up into multiple terms. Since I don't see why either the resurrection or the alternatives should affect the probability of HRM, terms like the probability of the HRM given the resurrection simplify to just the prior probability of the HRM. And so we have a simplified version of the messier equations from before. With this solution, we can reproduce Than's numbers from the previous section as follows. I like to always check to make sure that whatever equations I'm presenting are able to reproduce the work that has been presented so far. That's a check to make sure I haven't made a simple omission. The following prior probabilities are given by Than. The probability for the resurrection is 1 out of a million, and then the probability for all the alternatives would be 1 minus that. And the following likelihood values, given independent evidence and data, which Than calls E1, E2, and E3, the crucifixion, the multimodal postmortem appearances, and the conversion of skeptics, respectively, are the following values. Than's analysis at all points assumes the HRM is true, so he implicitly assigns the prior probability of the HRM being 1, and the probability of it not being true is 0. Plugging these into the equations above, we can reproduce Than's values. We start by writing one line for each hypothesis, using values wherever we know them, and noting that some terms are multiplied by 0, so they drop out. This leads us to the values for the numerators for Bayes' theorem and the sum for the total probability as shown, and finally to Than's numbers. This was just an exercise to show how the math works. The big issue is that no skeptic thinks the HRM is likely, or equivalently, that P of HRM is high. Instead, the skeptic would recognize that the probability for the HRM is much, much less than the probability of it being false. Probability of the HRM being false includes things like mixtures, such as texts that include some historical events, some embellishments, and some fabrications. What does the calculation look like now? Well, again, we start with the equations above with one line for each of the models, again broken up with the marginalization process. We will admit that even under the HRM model being false, both the resurrection hypothesis and the alternatives fit the data well. Because of this, we'd have the probability of the data given the resurrection and the HRM being false being approximately the same as probability of the data given the alternative and the HRM being false. We will just call this, quote, the same. Since for the skeptic, the probability that HRM is much, much less than the probability of it being false, the first term nearly drops out, and the calculation becomes the following. where we have one line for the resurrection and for the alternatives. And each of them is a product of two terms. One is the prior, which is to the far right, and the other term in brackets is made up of two parts from the marginalization. One part drops out, and the other part is the same number. So the calculation boils down to the priors, and the data has a negligible effect. So why is that? It's because mundane models can explain the, quote, text contains stories data, but don't need to explain the, quote, text contained facts data. If one wanted to be more precise here, one would need to look at specific models, as I said earlier, and actually handle those alternatives and what the data actually contain. But my calculation is enough to see the general points that 1. The HRM model, combined with a limited list of alternatives, such as hallucination and conspiracy, and a narrow data interpretation, all conspire to smuggle in the resurrection. For example, if the eyewitnesses say that 500 people saw Jesus after 3 days and ate with him, then hallucination becomes a pretty lousy explanation. Unfortunately for Than, no skeptic thinks these reports are reliable. 2. Underestimating the prior combines with the previous point to make the apologists much more confident in their preferred conclusion. Even if we had 500 people seeing Jesus afterward, with some claiming to eat with him, it still shouldn't convince anyone. We have events like the visions at Fatima as modern-day parallels. 3. If, however, the data are not necessarily dealing with eyewitnesses, then the data do not support 500 people actually seeing Jesus after 3 days, and only, quote, the Bible tells me so, that people ate with Jesus afterward, then there are good naturalistic explanations for that data. 4. Than wants to approach this as a two-step problem. Establish HRM is likely, and then, assuming HRM, use the data to argue for a resurrection. The problem is that skeptics don't buy the first step, so the second step becomes nearly meaningless. Luckily, Bayesian analysis should give the same answer whether you do the calculations as a two-step process or do the calculation all at once with all of the data.
If the Gospels are sincere historical reportage, then how well does the resurrection hypothesis explain the data? That's the question this article is answering. If you want to challenge the HRM itself and argue instead for a legendary development model or a redacted symbolic framework, we're happy to have that discussion, but that's a different argument than the one we're making here. Fine, but what about those low priors? At this point, someone might be willing to concede, okay, assuming your evidential assessments are fair, you've shown that the resurrection hypothesis gains significant ground, but they still object. Isn't the prior probability of a resurrection just too low for any evidence to overcome? That's a fair question, and a familiar one. We previously mentioned the Humean-style thoughts Paulogia has, and now it's time to cover those. This concern is often rooted in Humean-style objections to miracles, where the assumption isn't that the evidence is poor, but that miracles are so unlikely a priori that they can never be reasonably believed.
Than is conveniently leaving off, based on testimony alone. He acknowledged earlier that I don't have an a priori rejection of miracles, so why come back to it here and lump my name in as if I do? And importantly, based on testimony alone objection isn't just about low probability of miracles, it's about the astronomically high probability that testimony is on a spectrum of being mistaken or deliberately fabricated.
The Humean arguments for the low prior and how they fail. As a reminder, this view goes back to David Hume, who famously claimed, "A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be." In short, Hume argues that our consistent experience of the laws of nature is itself proof that a miracle didn't occur. The reasoning seems intuitive. Dead men stay dead. But Hume's argument collapses under scrutiny, both philosophically and probabilistically. 1. What are laws of nature? Laws of nature are not metaphysical forces or iron constraints. They are regularities, descriptions of how nature behaves when left to itself. But miracles, by definition, are not cases of nature left to itself. They are intentional interventions by an agent beyond nature.
The idea of, quote, left to itself, close quote, is misguided. That's not what the laws are. Physical laws are descriptions of what we actually observe and have confirmed with predictions. If miracles were part of what we observed and were confirmed with predictions, then they would also be part of the natural law. We can have no problem positing the existence of agents interacting with the world. And for much of human history, this was how many things were interpreted. Over time, however, we've needed agents less and less in the descriptions. Positing an agent gives no more useful information, but models with agents have extra complexity. We recall Laplace's famous statement that he had no need for the God hypothesis. We don't need to consider nature and divine as totally separate entities. Since we are inside of nature, any intrusion into nature, if that even makes sense, will just appear as part of nature and described in our laws. Unfortunately for the apologists, we just don't have good evidence for that.
Sometimes skeptics double down. No amount of testimony could ever be enough to justify belief in a miracle.
The actual quote from Hume is, quote, "When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision. Always I reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony should be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion." Close quote. Or another quote from Hume, quote, "The plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Even in that case, there is a mutual destruction of arguments, and the superior only gives us an assurance suitable to that degree of force which remains after deducting the inferior." Close quote. This is correct, and is a direct statement of Bayesian reasoning. Here in the odds form that Than likes, the probability of the miracle given the evidence divided by the probability that the miracle is false given the evidence is a ratio of a likelihood ratio times a prior ratio, where m is the miracle and e is the evidence. We can use the approximations that the probability of the evidence given the miracle is very close to 1. The evidence is expected if the miracle actually happened. And the probability that the miracle didn't happen is close to 1. This is essentially a statement that the miracle is rare, which is part of the definition of a miracle. This achieves the following ratio, that the ratio of the probability of the miracle happening to it not happening is a ratio of the prior probability of the miracle divided by the probability that the evidence we would see given that the miracle didn't happen, which we can read as the amount we favor the miracle explanation of the evidence is determined by how rare miracles are compared to how rare it is to get that evidence without the miracle, that the testimony is false. Hume unfortunately did not have the probability math to work from, so his verbiage is a bit cumbersome and less clear than it could be.
Paulogia has said this countless times, but that too fails under formal scrutiny. Consider the following result, adapted from standard Bayesian updating. Yes, this is even more math, but it is important. Let me explain what this math means. This equation expresses a powerful result in Bayesian inference, how cumulative testimony can overturn even the most extreme initial doubt. Let's walk through it step by step. On the left side, we have a posterior odds ratio. This represents the odds that the miracle M occurred versus that it didn't after receiving a body of testimony T1 through Tn. These testimonies are assumed to be independent reports, such as eyewitnesses saying they saw something miraculous.
Of course, the passion narratives in the canonical Gospels aren't independent reports. They're literally dependent on each other. They're all copying from Mark. Yes, even John.
Bottom line, even if we start with very low confidence in a miracle, i.e. a large K, as long as we have enough honest, independent testimonies, and each one is more likely if the miracle happened than if it didn't, then the overall odds in favor of the miracle can eventually become overwhelming. This is a formal mathematical refutation of the claim that no amount of testimony could ever justify belief in a miracle. Testimony, when weighted properly, absolutely can. So as long as each testimony is more expected if the miracle occurred than if it didn't, that is, then the overall odds will grow exponentially. Okay, I can feel people's eyes rolling over, so let me translate this. What the math means. This result tells us something very important. A sufficient number of independent testimonies, each with even a small evidential force, can overwhelm any finite prior against a miracle. This destroys Hume's everlasting check. A cumulative case can make any miracle credible in principle.
This proof depends on a couple of things that fail with the gospel accounts. One, it is a limit proof, which means it only holds when the number of testimonies n approaches infinity. We don't have an infinity of independent sources for the Gospels. Even at a gross overestimate, we might have 15 to 20 pieces of a testimony. Most limit proofs don't even start to kick in until n is 30, and that's under optimistic condition. Two, the proof assumes we can establish that each testimony is independent. This becomes more and more difficult as the number of testimonies is increased, and is particularly unlikely in the case of the Gospels, where there is strong evidence of dependence. So I've written about a model where I explore the scenario where our knowledge of the independence of 15 claims is not perfect. My conclusion is, quote, one can be supremely confident that all 15 sources are statistically independent at a probability of 0.9995, which is far higher than many scientific claims in published journals, and still not be able to justify the miracle claim due to this small uncertainty. This fact alone should disqualify the proof above. I've even shown in other writings how there are conditions where more testimony can actually be worse. In this way, it is shown that no amount of testimony can justify a miracle claim. One has to have much better evidence than testimony itself can provide. It is the same situation with claims of medical treatment. Testimony is just not enough to justify the effectiveness of a treatment. The bottom line is that the sort of Bayesian analysis that Than and other apologists do is pretty simplistic. They assume independence, binary model comparison, and limited alternatives, and come to wildly optimistic probabilities for rare events.
It's not about certainty, it's about probabilistic momentum, and if the resurrection enjoys testimony like this, then even low priors can eventually be defeated by the weight of the evidence. In short, yes, testimony can overcome low priors. No, there's no mathematical cap on how much evidence can update your beliefs. And yes, if you deny this, you're denying the entire structure of probabilistic inference.
While true that there is no cap, Than's thinking on this is simplistic due to the model choices, way of describing evidence, and binary thinking. Take a simple example that I like to use to educate students on model comparison, the high-low deck game, examined on my blog. In this example, one can see a string of consistent evidence making a particular model go up in probability and then go down. Not all cases have what Than is calling probabilistic momentum. In Than's case, his momentum is caused by not choosing alternatives well and only doing binary analysis.
The dead men stay dead argument and why it fails. The claim, given a sample size of 1,000 people and none have risen from the dead, the prior probability that Jesus rose from the dead is low. So, P of resurrection given K equals approximately 0. What's wrong with this? This logic only works if we use a frequentist interpretation of probability. Frequentism says the probability of A in a class B is the relative frequency of A occurring in B.
This is not a frequentist perspective. Part of the problem Than seems to have is that he wants to jump right into a prior probability value rather than actually trying to estimate it. So how does one estimate a prior probability? Historically, there have been 3 methods of obtaining prior probabilities. 1, the principle of maximum entropy. This is a generalization of Laplace's principle of indifference, where without any other information, all probabilities are given equal probabilities. 2, transformation groups. This is an idea proposed by E.T. Jaynes, where he uses symmetry to assign probabilities. And 3, one person's posterior is another person's prior. This is where you start with methods 1 or 2, augment with some information to obtain a posterior probability, and then use that as the prior for your next calculation. The dead men stay dead argument would run something like this as an estimate of the prior from Than's argument above. There is some prior probability for someone rising from the dead, which we will denote as theta. Think of this as a potentially biased coin that you're flipping. We'll say that the prior probability for this theta is uniform across all values from 0 to 1. This is an application of Laplace's principle of indifference. Now, we observe 1,000 people who have died. None of them have risen. This is like flipping a coin 1,000 times and it coming up tails every single time. What is the probability that the next person rises from the dead? Or, equivalently, one person flips heads on this coin. The math is straightforward. Applying Bayes' theorem to update our probability for theta leads us to Laplace's rule of succession for the best estimate of this probability, and that is the best estimate would be the number of heads I flip plus 1 divided by the total number of flips plus 2. For Than's number, the best estimate of the probability for rising from the dead is thus 1 over 1,000 plus 2. This fully Bayesian solution is very close to what Than accuses of as, quote, only working if we use a frequentist interpretation of probability, close quote. Of course, we've seen many more than 1,000 people dying and staying dead, so that number should really be closer to 100 billion. Also, it should be clear that staying dead is not entirely analogous to flipping a coin. We know quite a lot more about human biology and the physics of entropy to inform our model of staying dead. A body, quote, not staying dead would go against some of the best knowledge we have, literally trillions of experiments which back it up. It's hard to estimate a prior so small, and our intuitions will certainly fail quantitatively, but regardless, we know it must be much smaller than 1 over 100 billion. I'd say if the apologist ever had evidence that could legitimately raise probabilities from 1 over 100 billion to a modest number of even, say, 1 out of 10, I'd start looking at it in more detail. Not that I'd be convinced, but it would rise to the level of getting a second look.
So what kind of probability do we need when evaluating something like the resurrection? Answer, inductive probability. The kind we use when asking, given this background information and this testimony, how likely is it that this happened? All of this is extremely important because it all entails that our background knowledge can actually inform us on the prior probability of any hypothesis in spite of any statistical frequency. That's why the resurrection can be assessed probabilistically, even if its statistical frequency is 0. The question isn't, how often do resurrections occur? It's, given this testimony and background knowledge, how likely is it that one occurred here? And that's a fundamentally Bayesian question. Why the prior is not all that low for the resurrection? So far, we've granted an extremely skeptical starting point. We said fine, 1 in 1 million. Let's run the numbers anyway. And even then, the posterior climbed to nearly 88%. Then we looked at the arguments for the low priors that skeptics give and showed where they fail. Now, we can dig into reasons why the priors for the resurrection may not be as astronomically low as the skeptic may think. 1p of miracles given theism is not low. If God exists, a being with power, knowledge, and purpose, then miracles are not inherently improbable. They may be rare, but rare is not equal to unlikely, given the right conditions. In fact, under theism, we'd expect that God would act in history, that he would intervene for axiologically significant reasons, that he might use miracles to communicate or validate truth. So when someone says miracles don't happen, we should ask, given what? Atheism or theism?
Than needs to define what he means by theism to state that it is more likely to result in miracles. For example, a number of counterexamples could be made. Under the Greek pantheon, it is more likely that things would be chaotic, at the will of capricious deities, and that there may not be regularity to contrast with miracles. Also, Zeus is unlikely to communicate with miracles. He'd rather show up himself and show off what he can do directly, and certainly not for axiologically significant reasons, for any sense of values. Gods or divine beings such as Cthulhu revel in chaos, and thus would make it much less likely to result in a regular universe. They also don't seem to want to communicate with miracles, and again, not for axiologically significant reasons. So when Than says theism, what he really means is the existence of miracle-making gods, but then his argument is circular. As an exercise, run through Than's math below, where he calculates the prior probability of a resurrection given theism and its properties, but instead of theism, insert something like Zeus or Loki, and see if any of the math tracks. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. This is a sign that the bias or answer is baked into the problem from the start.
This matters a lot. If you already believe in God or are agnostic, then miracle claims aren't starting at 0. To be clear, I'm not saying one needs to presuppose God's existence either. I am merely saying that if you are a theist or even an agnostic, then we have a reason to think the priors are not infinitesimally small. They're plausible within the theistic framework. 2p of incarnation given theism is also not low. Now, we go deeper. I wish I had more space to unpack this all, but for now, this will suffice. Not only is a miracle plausible under theism, the incarnation and resurrection are especially so. Let's consider the logic. If God exists and is perfectly good, and he wants to enter into relationship with human beings, and he wants to provide redemption, healing, and moral transformation, then the incarnation, God becoming man, fits beautifully.
And divine hiddenness reveals its ugly head if, quote, he wants to enter into a relationship with human beings. If your response is that God may have sufficient reasons to stay hidden to some, then you're admitting that the obvious action we'd expect from God is not correct. There is some unknown, unintuitive motivation, which then could apply to all of the intuitions that are being stated here. If we don't know why God might hide himself from some, then his motivations are unclear here. How can we possibly be confident that he wants to enter into a relationship with the human beings? Or that he, quote, wants to provide redemption, healing, and moral transformation? Even if we grant that God wants to enter into a relationship with human beings, why is incarnation a particularly likely way to do this? If I created an advanced AI and wanted to be in relationship with it, assuming they were capable, I don't have to become the AI to do that. I could just communicate with it in a method I know the AI could understand. I feel that so much of these arguments from Than and similar works of Swinburne show a lack of imagination and a lack of willingness to admit to other possibilities. As a result, they are all post hoc arguments, baking in the solution they want from the beginning.
And more than that, a vindicating miracle like the resurrection makes sense as part of this cosmic drama. And this is where my cosmic story theodicy and axiological structure enters. If God wants a redemptive story, and that story involves suffering, death, and the defeat of evil, then the resurrection of Christ functions as the narrative climax of that arc. This isn't just God did a cool thing once, it's the turning point of a cosmic narrative.
This is entirely post hoc. No one who hadn't already heard the Christian story would ever suggest any of these theological models. Than may not believe this is what he's doing, so the only way I see to settle the matter is for Than to actually make testable predictions of his theory or framework. Since he claims he's doing just what they do in science, this is exactly how arguments of perceived bias in researchers are settled in science. Make the predictions and do the experiments. I'll wait.
Someone might say, sure, maybe that's how it would go if God exists, but do we see this kind of thing happening? The answer is yes. As Craig Keener has documented in detail, there are thousands of modern miracle claims worldwide.
Absolutely. Thousands of claims, and none of them confirmed. This, from a Bayesian perspective, is very strong evidence against miracles being real, and that claims are not enough to justify them. I have dealt with miracles in many places, including a very long discussion on miracles on the Digital Gnosis channel, where we go through claim by claim, and a discussion on miracles on the Still Unbelievable podcast on a few episodes. As a side comment, Than referred to a miracle healing in his debate with Matt Dillahunty, which Matt later shows has no documentary support at all, making it worse than all of the miracle claims we looked at in the long discussion on miracles on Digital Gnosis.
They're not all equally strong, but the sheer volume and pattern, many with corroboration, point towards something real.
No, it doesn't. The sheer volume of claims of witchcraft, alien sightings, psychic phenomena, does not point to anything real other than the real property of humans to see things that aren't there, and to believe strongly in things that have not been confirmed.
And this bolsters the prior. The resurrection is not utterly unlike anything else ever claimed. It fits within a broader pattern of divine action that continues today. This raises the plausibility that something like this happened at the start of Christianity.
I agree that it, quote, raises the plausibility that something like this happened at the start of Christianity, close quote. A number of people saw things that weren't there and believed strongly in things not confirmed, just like today. This means that given the data of texts with stories of magical claims, and the current wealth of unconfirmed magical claims, the probability of actual magic happening in the past is reduced to near zero.
Therefore, the prior for the resurrection is not just some arbitrary number plucked from thin air. It depends on your broader worldview. Here's how it stacks up. Under naturalism, the prior is extremely low. Under theism, the prior is moderate to high. Under theism, plus incarnation, plus moral purpose, the prior is very high. We granted the lowest prior just to show how much weight the evidence could bear.
You didn't grant the lowest prior. You granted a smallish prior for events that could happen in a night of cards, but not small compared to even some lotteries, and nowhere near small enough to justify rewriting physics and biology.
But the more you take theology and metaphysical background into account, the less that burden is needed. In short, the resurrection is not only defensible in spite of the prior, it becomes expected once the right framework is in place.
The, quote, right framework seems to be starting with a prior at least 100,000 times too high, assuming nearly all your position is true up front, and cherry-picking what you count as evidence. This is indeed the right framework to convince yourself of something false, the same framework used by astrologers, psychics, UFO enthusiasts, and faith healers.
Testing the resurrection with more accurate priors. We've now seen two things. One, even under radically low priors, the resurrection hypothesis dramatically outperforms its competitors. Two, that low prior wasn't warranted to begin with if we're working under a theistic framework. So let's take the next step and run the numbers again, but this time with more accurate priors that reflect the wider metaphysical context.
This is where Than is putting in his presuppositions and making it look quantitative.
Bayesian analysis is a quantification and mathematical description of presuppositions and natural decision-making processes.
All right, we can stop
anything
there. I don't know where he got the word presupposition or anything like that.
Step 1. Assign a neutral prior for theism. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we're agnostic between atheism and theism. That is, probability of theism is 0.5. Probability of atheism is 0.5.
While technically agnostic, the theism in this has to include every possible theistic belief, of which there are millions, most of which undermine his calculations below. If Than, as I suspect, is really using theism as a stand-in for Christian theism, then he really wants to write the probability of Christian theism is 0.5, the probability of not Christian theism is 0.5. And this is a definite pro-Christian bias in the calculation by many orders of magnitude, given all of the other religions in the not Christian theism block.
Next, we ask, if God exists, what is the probability that he would become incarnate in human history? While I personally think the theism entails, or at the very least makes extremely likely, an incarnation, I will assign a low value for dramatic effect. Probability of incarnation given theism is 0.1.
Whenever I see probabilities like this, I ask myself, how could you test this value to see if it is even ballpark? As far as I can tell, there's no way, even in theory, to establish if this number should be 0.1, 0.9, 1 out of 100,000, or any other value, so the calculation is basically useless. One cannot do a meaningful calculation without some way of confirming the values used. Also, either theism is including many other God depictions other than the Christian one, and this probability is not well motivated, or it is a stand-in for Christian theism, in which case Than is just baking in his preferred solution from the start. Other than already being exposed to a story about incarnate God, I see no reason to expect this under theism. Classic post hoc reasoning.
Now, if God does become incarnate, what's the probability that he would validate that incarnation through resurrection? Given our background knowledge, defeating death and inaugurating redemption, this is much higher. Say, probability of resurrection given incarnation is 0.9.
Other than already being exposed to a story about a resurrected incarnate God, I see no reason to expect this. I could imagine an incarnate God behaving much like Superman and wouldn't need a resurrection. Imagination could come up with a near infinite number of variants. I think Than and other apologists are just not being imaginative enough and are just biased toward the one story they were raised with. I ask again, how could you test this value to see if it is even in the ballpark?
Now we chain the conditionals. We're going to calculate probability of resurrection equals probability of theism times probability of incarnation given theism times probability of resurrection given incarnation. Insert the numbers. Probability of resurrection is 0.045. So now we have a 4.5% prior instead of 0.0001%. That's a 450 increase in the starting plausibility of the resurrection, even with me extending the skeptic and olive branch.
Given the problems I've stated already, and the fact that this preferred solution has been baked in from the start, this is not a surprising result. The biggest problem, perhaps, is that Than thinks he's extending the skeptic and olive branch when he's done nothing of the sort.
Even after just 1 or 2 lines of evidence, you'll already have very strong confirmation. Low priors are not a death sentence. They can be defeated with strong evidence.
It's too bad that the apologists don't have that strong evidence.
But the prior itself was never that low to begin with if we're working in a theistic worldview.
If you are, quote, working in a theistic worldview, quote, it's essentially an admission that you're biasing the argument, especially in the way that Than uses it as a stand-in for working in a Christian worldview, where
if God exists, miracles are expected. If God is good, incarnation is likely. If God incarnates, resurrection is probable.
Other God depictions do not have these properties, so Than is showing his hand here. But we can go further. If miracles are expected if God exists, then why have miracles become less verified as we've become better at possibly detecting them? When we put a camera in everyone's pocket, the number of UFO sightings has gone down, not up, the classic mark of a false claim. The same is true for miracles. If miracles actually happen, we'd expect many more observed on video as we increase the number of cameras. We'd expect many more medical records before and after a miracle claim now that records are much more standardized. However, we actually observe the exact opposite.
Bonus. Paulogia's talking dragon analogy and why it backfires. If you've read this far and are thinking, Than, you have no way of knowing this is what's going on in Paul's head based on a simple tweet. Here's the thing. I am a mind reader. In all seriousness, I am making inferences. Sure, but that's not a flaw. That's literally what historical reasoning does. We infer intentions, reliability, and plausibility based on contextualized patterns. And that's exactly what Paulogia claims to do when arguing against the resurrection. So it would be inconsistent to fault that very method here. And I'm not guessing, I'm tracking a pattern. Take this tweet, posted a few days after the original thread we analyzed.
If a highly detailed, realistic-sounding story about going to the bank includes a talking dragon, does that make the A, bank details less likely, or B, dragon detail more likely?
Let's pause here. This is a parody of the Maximal Data Case. He's implying that detailed realism in one part of a story does not justify believing the miraculous part. But if that's the point, then Paulogia has, again, misunderstood the argument. No one is saying, because some details are accurate, everything must be. That would be a clear non sequitur.
I consider Twitter to be a silly place. So when I post something there, it's almost always in response to one of the many silly comments that come at me every single day from less sophisticated Christians, some of whom do think that because details are accurate, that everything must be. You're the one who saw yourself in this tweet.
Instead, the Maximal Data Case says, the data we find in the Gospels and Acts is more expected on the HRM relative to any of the skeptical models of the Gospels and Acts, and that in turn raises the likelihood of certain kinds of testimony, which then get evaluated using Bayesian criteria, not naive credulity.
I think Brian's already fully covered why this is a distinction without a difference.
Absolutely. The math says that the presuppositions are baked into the analysis from the start.
But wait, there's more. In this video, at the 25-minute mark, and other places, Paulogia says,
when an apologist says maximal case for the resurrection, what they mean is that secondary literature has affirmed for them that it's okay for them to simply believe the non-mundane claims in the primary literature because they're adjacent to mundane claims, which is just with extra steps.
That's not only a mischaracterization, it perfectly confirms what I've been arguing all along. He thinks the problem is the non-mundanity of the claims. He thinks apologists are just smuggling in miracle claims by writing on the back of mundane ones. He sees no epistemic weight in testimony for the miraculous because his prior is too low to budge, which brings us back to where this all started. This isn't just a disagreement about data. It's a breakdown in how probability works when testimony concerns something extraordinary. If Paulogia thinks historical realism in the Gospels doesn't raise the probability that the authors are honestly reporting what they believed they saw, then his skepticism isn't just against miracles, it's against inference itself. Taken to its logical end, this is an outright denial of math.
Now hold on there. There's a big difference between honestly reporting what they believed and honestly reporting what they believed they saw.
That's a massive goalpost shift.
And a much bigger claim than based on eyewitnesses that you've used up until now. That would be a lot more burden of proof and allow me to discard Mark and Luke immediately, since not even evangelicals claim they were personal eyewitnesses. That said, sincerity isn't my concern. Mistaken is necessarily a subcategory of sincere.
And that's the real problem. This isn't just a philosophical misstep. It's mathematical malpractice.
It totally isn't mathematical malpractice. 1, quote, he thinks the problem is the non-mundanity of the claims, close quote. It does matter what the priors are. Ignoring them or grossly overestimating them could be termed mathematical malpractice. 2, quote, he thinks apologists are just smuggling in miracle claims by writing on the back of mundane ones, close quote. Apologists are actually doing this. The support for the HRM and the Max Data Case is entirely from mundane claims. This is then springboarded into raising the probability of the resurrection, a miraculous claim. 3, quote, he sees no epistemic weight in testimony for the miraculous, close quote. Not no weight, but not nearly enough to raise the prior for the miraculous. For the same reason, we could not accept testimony alone to modify any law of physics. It's a basic property of the types of evidence and alternative models and follows directly from Bayesian analysis. So as far as I can tell, Than is just upset that his preferred miracle claims are not taken seriously by anyone who isn't already convinced. But hopefully, this analysis presented here will allow him to either structure his thinking better or to point out where I've gone wrong.
Mistake number 1, misunderstanding the maximal case. No maximal data argument says, if some parts of the story are realistic, then everything must be true. That would be an obvious fallacy. What we actually argue is the cumulative historical realism, undesigned coincidences, name frequency congruence, local knowledge, etc., significantly increases the probability that the source is aiming to report experienced events, not invent them. And if we assume the Gospels and Acts are broadly reliable reportage, the HRM, then the likelihood of the resurrection testimony occurring under that model is far higher than if the accounts are late, literary, or legendary. In other words, realism in mundane details raises the prior for sincere testimony, and that affects how we evaluate miraculous claims.
The real logic should be confirmed realism in mundane details raises the probability of unconfirmed mundane details. It may or may not raise the probability of rare events depending on the alternatives. We can see this in a toy problem, which is one of the benefits of Bayesian analysis, the ability to spin out possible models and explore the consequences. Say we measure the overall reliability of a text with a number from 0 to 1. We'll call this theta, and we'll represent the probability that any random claim in the text is true. This is like having a biased coin, which we flip. Heads, the claim is true, tails, the claim is false. As we externally confirm the claims, it will be like having data on previous flips of the coin, and we update our estimate for theta, the reliability. Roughly, the best estimate of theta will follow Laplace's rule of succession, where NH is the number of externally confirmed claims, and T is the number of externally disconfirmed claims, and theta is our best estimate for the probability that the next claim we look at will be true. We're interested in the probability of a particular miracle. M is true given the claim of that miracle in the text. C, we can then write out the probability of that miracle given the claim, again following Bayes' rule straightforwardly. We'll make the following assumptions and definitions. The probability of a claim is made given that the miracle actually happened is called theta. That's the kind of reliability of the text. The probability a claim is made given that the miracle event did not occur is the opposite of what we mean by reliability, so that'll be 1 minus theta. The prior probability of the miracle is defined for convenience as just m. There are no instances of any of the claims being disconfirmed externally, so we're going to say that nt is 0. This, in my view, gives a definite pro-miracle bias to this model. There's a sequence of n confirmed claims before we are examining the miracle claim. So the n confirmed claims will bring the estimate of the reliability, theta, closer and closer to 1. This is exactly what Than is trying to show with his evidence. From these assumptions and the definitions, we can rewrite the equations above, and just simply plugging in the various values gets a little messy. But then, if we want to believe the miracle claim, we should have the probability of the miracle given the claim being greater than 0.5. And this leads us, with a little bit of algebra, to a simple equation where the number of confirmed claims has to be greater than a term 1 over m minus 2. So it's related to the prior probability of the miracle. After all this math, the final equation is simple enough that we can use it to determine the number of claims that need to be externally verified to believe the next unverified claim, either mundane or miraculous, depending on the prior of the next claim. We never put any restrictions on the value of m. For example, if the prior is moderate, say a mundane claim, like m is 0.1, then the number of externally verified previous claims would be n equals 8, and we need only a handful of externally verified claims before we believe this new mundane claim. However, if the prior is tiny, like 1 in 100 billion, the optimistic prior that I've used for the resurrection of Jesus, then n is around 100 billion claims that must be externally verified before this new claim is to be believed. No amount of text would be able to reach this threshold. This is a toy example and doesn't address all the aspects of historical inference, but it has the benefit of tying the numbers one estimates to concrete, quantifiable pieces of data. One of the powers of Bayesian inference is to be able to explore these sorts of toy problems to improve one's intuition in cases where the numbers may become unwieldy.
Mistake number 2, letting the prior corrupt the model worse. There's a probabilistic error lurking underneath. Paulogia and many others let their low prior on miracles influence how they model the Gospels. They assume the Gospels can't be historically reliable. That would make a miracle more likely. And miracles can't be likely. That's circular reasoning.
Yeah, that's not what I do.
There are many reasons to think the Gospels are not historically reliable. Their dependence on each other, seeming conflicting accounts, the lack of stated sources, and the inclusion of miraculous claims. Historians don't treat texts as all or nothing, either correct in everything it says or completely wrong. It's a mixture of possibly true stuff and possibly made up or distorted stuff.
He assumes that the maximal data approach tries to smuggle in belief in the resurrection by writing the coattails of mundane details.
Well, yes. By your own words, your maximal data approach assumes historical reportage model. The conclusion of historical reportage model relies on affirmation of mundane details. Ergo, maximal data approach relies on affirmation of mundane details.
This isn't a debate about a few ancient documents. This is a debate about the structure of rational belief revision. If you think realism in a document can't raise the likelihood that its authors believed what they claimed, then you're rejecting historical reasoning.
I could have granted that right from the start for the sake of argument, that the gospel authors believed what they claimed.
There's just no reason to think they were in a position to know if it was true.
So let's just take on a silly tweet. Paulogia's Talking Dragon tweet is meant to parody maximal data reasoning. The structure of the analogy is, if a highly detailed, realistic-sounding story about going to the bank includes a talking dragon, does that make the dragon more likely? Intuitively, the answer seems like no. And that's what the skeptic wants you to conclude. That mundane detail doesn't boost the plausibility of extraordinary claims. But there's a big problem. This analogy collapses under formal analysis. The analogy confuses events with testimony about events. Suppose we have two hypotheses. H1, the story is fabricated or fictional, e.g., someone made it up. H2, the story is sincere testimony. The author is reporting what they believed happened.
You do realize this is a pointless dichotomy, right? Because the category of mistaken is a subset of sincere testimony. Showing that the testimony is more likely sincere does nothing to defend against being sincerely mistaken.
Now let E equals a document containing multiple true mundane details plus one extraordinary claim, e.g. a talking dragon. So what do we ask in Bayesian terms? We're not asking whether probability that dragon exists given realistic bank details. We're asking whether probability that author is testifying honestly given realistic bank details. And that can go up dramatically when the details are unexpected, accurate, confirmed independently, known only by someone present, distributed unintentionally, undesigned, and more. This is precisely how we reason about historical testimony, journalism, and even courtroom eyewitnesses.
None of these things are a defense against being dishonest about the dragon. The best lies have a kernel of truth. We have a word called verisimilitude, which means the quality of seeming true or having the appearance of being real. It's a tool of fiction writers and liars alike. You include as many realistic details as possible to make the non-realistic parts seem more plausible. All these things tell you is that the person telling the story had access to confirmable details.
If the document includes dozens of accurate, hard-to-fake, contextual, or interlocking details, then P of E given HT, P of E given HF, which means LR greater than 1. This raises the probability that the author is testifying, not inventing, and that matters when the testimony includes extraordinary claims. I am not saying this means the dragon was real. All this entails is what I am saying, which is, again, merely that the author is testifying honestly.
Again, no. This math can't distinguish between a motivated liar and a sincere person. At best, it decreases the chance of an uninformed liar.
If you still don't see the issue, here is a counterexample. Imagine someone says, I was assaulted on 5th Street at 11:42 p.m. The car was blue. License plate NY2934. And a man in a red jacket grabbed me near the bus stop outside Emilio's Deli. When he attacked me, he spoke as if he had 10 different voices coming out of him, like a legion of demons. Now suppose all the mundane details check out. The deli exists, the timestamp matches CCTV, and a man in a red jacket is seen there. Would that not make the core testimony more credible? We're not saying the red jacket proves the demon voice. We're saying that accuracy and detail increases the probability that the author is reporting, not inventing. The explanation for demon part of her testimony could be that she is mistaken, or could be that it was a demon. This example is merely pointing out the presence of something non-mundane in testimony does not render the testimony less reliable.
Actually, it does make it less reliable, and I'd need external corroboration of the statements to even believe this person. If I just heard the claim, I'd be skeptical about the details. What we don't have in the gospel is that level of detail on the mundane claims. Almost all of the, quote, facts that are presented can be produced through literary construction, unlike a detail like, quote, license plate NY2934, quote, externally verified by cameras. In fact, even with those details, the fact that the person reported hearing 10 voices and being attacked lowers my assessment of the attack itself. It's much easier to explain that the person has some real-world sensory input, example like the blue car and the red jacket, and had some internal hallucination, the attack and 10 voices. We'd have to see evidence of an actual attack, in addition to the mundane claims, so the picture isn't as cut and dried as Than would want.
Conclusion. We've now walked through a structure of reasoning that most people, skeptics and believers alike, have never seen applied this rigorously to the resurrection. Most people are used to a minimal facts style approach, where we take a few vague data points and try to argue from there.
We both agree a minimal facts approach doesn't cut it.
This is not like that. This article was only a small taste of the argument from a larger scale. There is a lot we did not cover, including the objections you're probably thinking about right now.
That is correct. So many objections I'm thinking about right now.
This is a structured argument that follows a lot of nuance. We began by assuming a deeply skeptical prior, just a 1 in a million chance that Jesus rose from the dead. And we didn't try to argue that number up. We left it there. Then, piece by piece, we evaluated how much more expected the historical evidence is under the resurrection hypothesis than under any of its competitors. And we watched the scales move, not arbitrarily, but mathematically.
Now that I'm finishing up, I want to summarize the situation for myself. Probability theory is one of my favorite topics, and I love figuring out the different ways that arguments can be structured and explored. I'm a firm believer that Bayes' theorem codifies the proper way to do reasoning, but it comes at a price to do it correctly. One has to be careful not to build your conclusions into the models or to use arbitrary values, except in purely academic or educational examples. One has to be diligent to test each conclusion in more than one way, to find ways to estimate prior probabilities, and to include as many relevant, specific alternative models in any analysis. This is one of the benefits of Bayesian reasoning, that you have to put all your cards on the table up front. And finally, one has to be satisfied sometimes that the data you actually have is just not enough to support the models that you want to pursue. What Than has shown here is really the opposite of proper use of Bayesian reasoning. He doesn't start with a, quote, deeply skeptical prior. A few minutes' work to compare his prior to other scenarios shows that Than's prior barely makes it out of a knight's card game, let alone demonstrate a violation of physics and biology. His determination of what's expected under the resurrection hypothesis is severely incomplete, ignoring many things that would be expected but aren't observed. Further, what he calls historical evidence for the comparison is not the actual evidence we have. He's taking the stories at face value at all points of his argument. This allows him to discount common alternative models for the data. A more honest reading of the data, that we have collections of stories about various events, is well explained by many alternatives, including James Fodor's RHBS model and Paulogia's own minimal witnesses model. Combining all this into a proper analysis puts the resurrection hypothesis on the losing probability side. Finally, it is worth repeating that at no point can the data of testimony, whether ancient or modern, confirm something that has such a low prior probability as a miracle, even if the miracle itself actually happened. So if that's all the apologist has as data, then they cannot use it to support the resurrection, and all of Than's math, when done properly, doesn't solve the problem. It's been fun exploring all these topics and to really see what this kind of analysis can and can't tell you.
If you're still skeptical, that's okay. But now, the burden is on you. You can't simply wave your hand and say, miracles don't happen.
I wave my hand and say, testimony alone is insufficient to establish a miracle. And then I wait to see if anyone has anything to offer other than testimony.
You have to offer a better model, one that makes the evidence we have more expected than the resurrection hypothesis does. Not just possible, not just maybe, but more probable, step by step. And that's the question that still hasn't been answered by critics like Paulogia. Given this data and given this model, what alternative explains it better? Until that question is answered with equivalent rigor, the maximal data case for the resurrection stands, not as wishful thinking, but as an inference to the best explanation.
That's as ridiculous as saying, granting my minimal witnesses model, what alternative explains it better? Unless you've answered that question, minimal witness case for the resurrection stands. No, the data is that the stories exist, not that the stories are true. For the sake of this discussion, I was granting sincerity and doubting only veracity to still arrive at an unlikely resurrection. But that doesn't scratch the surface of all the scholars who find it obvious that the gospel authors did feel free to invent and embellish details. And if the HRM doesn't stand, obviously maximal data doesn't stand either.
Editors, note, this is an academic level version of the more pop level response I wrote. If you want a more condensed and simpler read, please consider reading that version instead.
Too late, you're already this far, and it's all you're gonna get. Thank you so much for coming back, Brian. I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone else has as well. Thank you so much for watching, and for more of this former Christian, taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.